Okay, so this is just solving equations, again, more solving of trigonometric equations, but this is called Tricky Solve because it's got a couple of little tricks to it, just making sure that you remember things from Algebra 2 and in order to solve. So if you look at number 1, if we're going to solve this, remember when you solve something, the whole goal is just to get x by itself. So in this case, if I'm going to get x by itself, the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 1. And that leaves me 2 sine x in parentheses squared equals 3. So now the next thing I'm going to have to do at this point is to take the square root of both sides. Remember, we're just solving and trying to get x by itself. So I've got to get rid of the squared. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Now don't forget, when you take a square root, there's not just one answer, but actually 2. So it'll be the positive and negative square root of 3. And on the left-hand side, it just cancels out the squared. So I'm left with 2 sine x equals both positive and negative square root of 3. Remember, the whole goal here is to get x by itself. So the next thing I'm going to do is get rid of that 2 by dividing by 2. And so now I have sine x equals the positive and negative square root of 3 over 2. All right, well, square root of 3 over 2 is on the unit circle. So I am looking for answers on the unit circle where I would have square root of 3 over 2. Well, don't forget, sine is your y value. So if you're using your left hand trick, I need 3 fingers on bottom, which means I'm going to fold in this finger. And that tells me that I've got 1 finger on top for cosine, 3 fingers on bottom for sine. So that's going to be square root of 3 over 2 at this finger, which when you're using your left hand trick, remember that's pi over 3, pi over 4, pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. So that's pi over 3. So at pi over 3, I get square root of 3 over 2. So I know at pi over 3, I get positive square root of 3 over 2. But I also could get negative square root of 3 over 2. So I'm going to look for, in this case it says all of the answers on the interval 0 to 2 pi. So in this case, because it's both positive and negative square root of 3, it's going to be all square root of 3 over 2. It's going to be all of the answers that have a square root, or have a 3 in the denominator. So in quadrant 1, that would be pi over 3. In quadrant 2, that would be 2 pi over 3. In quadrant 3, that would be 4 pi over 3. And in quadrant 4, it's going to be 5 pi over 3. Alright, so in number 2, remember the whole goal here is to solve this, or to get x by itself. So we got to get rid of everything that's there that's with the x. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 5. And I get 2 cosine x squared equals 1. And now, looks like the next thing I need to do is divide by 2. So now I have cosine of x squared equals 1/2. Now remember, your whole goal here is to get x by itself. Right now, x is trapped inside those parentheses with cosine because of that square on the outside. So I'm going to have to get rid of that square by taking the square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Now right there, when I do that, on the left-hand side, that cancels out the square, and you're left with just cosine x. On the right-hand side, the square root of 1/2. Well, the top square root of 1 is a perfect square, but 2 is not. So I end up with 1 square root of 2, which you then have to rationalize. So multiply both top and bottom by square root of 2, and you get square root of 2 over 2. Don't forget, when you take a square root, both a positive and negative answer exist. So again, I have both plus and minus, this time square root of 2 over 2. So now I've got to get x by itself. So we're going to arc cosine right here. And if I arc cosine the left to get rid of the cosine, I have to arc cosine the right. So I am looking for where cosine is square root of 2 over 2. You probably all have that one memorized, but just in case you don't, left hand trick, cosine is your x value, which means you need 2 fingers on top. 1, 2, you fold that one in. That finger is pi over 4. So x is going to equal pi over 4. That would give me positive square root of 2 over 2. We're going all the way around the unit circle because if you look up at the instructions, it says all the answers on 0 to 2 pi. So that's all the way around the unit circle. So anything, because it's both positive and negative square root of 2 over 2, it doesn't matter which quadrant I'm in. All students take calculus because I'm looking for both positive and negative answers of cosine. So in quadrant 1, it's pi over 4. In quadrant 2, it would be 3 pi over 4. In quadrant 3, that'd be 5 pi over 4, and then 7 pi over 4. All right, number 3. Process is the same. We're still trying to isolate x, get x by itself. First step here is to add 2 to both sides. So I have 2 tan x squared equals 28. Now divide by 2. So tan x squared equals, that'd be 32, all right. 16. Take the square root of both sides, and I get tan x equals positive and negative 4. Now, this time, 4 is not on the unit circle. So in this case, not tangent of 4. It is not on the unit circle. So I am going to have to, this time, go to my calculator, and when I clear this tangent by arctangent the left, I have to arctangent the right. I'm going to go to my calculator, and I'm going to arctangent and in this case, we should be in radians, so make sure that you've got your calculator in radians. What we did yesterday had us in degrees, so you have to switch your calculator. So I'm going to do arctangent of 4, and I get 1.326. So x equals 1.326. When you arctangent would also be where you add in 2 pi in or pi in. I am going to go ahead and do that because this is telling me to go all the way around the unit circle, which is 2 pi in. So I'm going to add in pi in right here and see if we can get more answers that would be less than 2 pi. And I'm also going to do arctangent of negative 4, and that may give me my other answer. Okay, it happens to give me negative 1.326 plus pi in. So now I'm going to plug in 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I plug in 0 for n here, then my first answer that I'm going to get is going to be 1.326. If I do 1.326 plus pi, that gives me 4.446. If I were to add pi to this, it would go over 2 pi. Remember, 2 pi as a decimal is 6.28. But I do need to do my negative version. Obviously, I don't need the first negative answer if I was plugging in 0, because it would be negative, and I'm supposed to be on the interval of 0 to 2 pi. But if I do negative 1.326 plus pi, I get x equals 1.8155. And then I'm going to add pi again. Because remember, with tangent, you just add pi. So I get 4.956. And that's it, because if I added pi one more time, it would be too much. So there's the 4 answers for this one. Alright, so then the next thing, that was all finding squares and square roots. So on the next one, this is zero products. Now, if you'll look over here at the example, it shows exactly what they're talking about. And you guys remember this from Algebra 2. If you factor something, you can then set each separate piece equal to 0 and solve them separately. And in this case, it's no different. This is, thankfully right now, for the beginning of this. These two pieces have already been factored. So you're going to have two separate problems. 2 cosine x minus 1 gets to equal 0, and cosine x plus 1 gets to equal 0. Okay, so now I want you to remember cosine has two answers. So this cosine is going to have two answers because cosine has two answers. Remember, a going down and a coming up answer. And this cosine is going to have two answers, a going down and a coming up answer. So just remember, you're going to end up probably with more answers than you thought because we started out with two separate pieces. And then you just solve each one separately. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And then divide by 2. So I get cosine of x equals 1/2. Remember, we're solving, so we're trying to get x by itself. We're going to arc cosine. If I arc cosine this side, I have to arc cosine that side. That does get my x by itself, and 1/2 is on the unit circle, so I'm looking for cosine, which is your x value, means I need one finger on top, so I fold this one in, and that's pi over 3. Now this time, it is just positive 1/2. So cosine is positive at pi over 3. And it is positive again if we're going around the unit circle. We can do our 2 pi in if you want to do it that way, or we can do all students take calculus. I know that cosine is going to be positive again in quadrant 4, which would be at 5 pi over 3. So those are my two answers for this left-hand equation. Now you need one for the right-hand equation. So I subtract 1 from both sides, and I get cosine of x equals -1. Now we're going to arc cosine that. If I arc cosine the left, to get rid of cosine, I have to arc cosine the right. Okay, so I'm looking for where cosine is -1. Now don't forget, on your unit circle, remember, it's a unit circle because it has a radius of 1. So we know that this is pi over 6, and this is pi over 4, and this is pi over 3. But don't forget that right here, this is 0 or 2 pi. This ordered pair is the ordered pair 1, 0. So cosine is 1 right here. It is -1 on the other side, where at pi. So that's where cosine ends up being -1, so x equals pi. Now because we're only going on the interval of 0 to 2 pi, that's the only place. So there happens to be 3 answers to this problem instead of 4, because this one's actually on the axis. Alright, so you're going to do the same thing on problem number 5, but you'll notice we've got both a tangent and a sine in this problem. It doesn't matter, except for you just got to keep straight what you're doing. So tangent of x minus 1 equals 0, and sine of x plus 1 equals 0. So you're just going to solve each one separately. So I'm going to solve the tangent piece by adding 1 to both sides. So I get tangent of x equals 1. We need to arc tangent that in order to get rid of the word tangent. If you arc tangent the left, you have to arc tangent the right. Alright, so I'm looking for where tangent is 1. Well, if you remember, tangent is 1. If you're thinking about the unit circle, tangent is y over x. Well, the only thing that can make two fractions equal 1 is if you have the same thing on top as you do on bottom. And the only place that happens is right here, because that gives me 2 fingers on top and 2 fingers on bottom. The other good thing to do is, we talked about earlier, going ahead and making that chart so that you have your tangents all already figured out. But tangent is 1 at pi over 4. So I know at pi over 4 it's 1, and I'm looking for the other place on the unit circle where tangent is positive. All students take, so it is positive in quadrant 3, so that's going to be 5 pi over 4. Now we'll do the same thing for our sine piece, subtract 1. So I get sine of x equals -1. Arc sine both sides in order to get rid of the sine. and I'm looking for where sine is -1. So going back to the unit circle, if you'll remember, at these two places, cosine is 1 and -1, which means at these two places, this is 0, 1, and this one is 0, -1. So this is the one I need. If you remember, that is 3 pi over 2. So my answer here is going to be 3 pi over 2. That's the only place on the unit circle, when you're going just one trip around, where sine is -1. All right, last one. Same thing. 2 plus cosine x equals 0. 2 sine x equals 0. Subtract 2. I get cosine x equals -2. This one I'm going to divide by 2, and I get sine x equals 0. All right, so I'm going to arc cosine in order to get rid of the word cosine. 2 is not a value that you would find by itself on the unit circle. So I'm going to arc cosine and put -2 in there. And I get an error message, which means that this doesn't work. So this part of it is no solution. So let's try this one. What about sine x equals 0? Well, that is on the unit circle. Remember, sine is your y value. And we just looked at this. My y value is 0 both here and here. So at pi and 2 pi. All right, so it's called tricky solve, but I don't know that it was really all that tricky.